I'll begin my story tonight somewhere between the best and the worst, about 6 years ago in October of 2008. I was just on the cusp of starting to write my book. I knew that I had a story to tell, and I believed that writing was therapeutic, but I was suffering serious symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and was caught in a cycle of reliving trauma every time I spoke about what had happened. I was desperate for a voice, and I wanted to make sense of my experience, but I felt very overwhelmed. I wanted to create a positive future for myself, but my self-confidence had been destabilized, and the world that I trusted in broken in many places. Perhaps worst of all for me, I had difficulty connecting with the person that I had always known myself to be, someone who is joyful, outgoing, trusting, and respected. I had just turned 30. And after spending most of my 20s traveling and working, I was on the brink of an exciting new decade of life, one which I hoped would be defined by motherhood. But just a month exactly into my marriage, while away at a counseling conference, a police officer arrived at my hotel room door and told me that Jason was in custody. He had called 911 the night before to ask for help after brutally sexually assaulting 2 women customers in the store where he worked, and then kidnapping them to our home, which is very close by. He wanted the police to come and rescue the women, and he'd called from a payphone so that once he knew the women were safe, he could drive into the woods and hang himself. Hearing this unbelievable news sent me into complete shock. I couldn't speak. All I could think was, what happened? What happened to you, Jason? As the beautiful life that I'd worked so hard to build shattered. In that instant, with the police officer standing in front of me in my hotel room, I began a horrific transition from my role as a happy, contented newlywed and respected professional to being the wife of a sex offender. As a counselor myself, I knew I needed help to cope, but services for families of offenders were basically non-existent. I didn't seem to fit anyone's mandate, and having lost the medical benefits associated with my job, I couldn't afford private treatment. Even with my official victim status, I was turned away from victim services and told I didn't belong there, that I needed to give others time and understand the seriousness of the offenses, as if for 1 second I didn't. I also kept visiting Jason at the prison. I told him what was happening to me in the community because he needed to know. And though he became even more devastated, remorseful, and disgusted with himself, he was powerless to take on the anger and disgrace that was being put upon me. For 9 months, he was locked away in solitary confinement, and I was left. I realized then a truth about jails that I'd never before considered, that just as they keep society safe from dangerous people, at least for as long as they're there, they also protect those same people from facing up to the harm that they caused, from being able to make amends, and from being meaningfully accountable for what they did to the people that they hurt. I reflected on the fact that I'd never given much thought before to what the family of someone who offends might go through, but now the reality was painfully real. I started to hope that one day I could work to alleviate this suffering, bring better understanding to the issues, and break down some of the stigma and offer help to the forgotten victims of crime. But first, I knew I had to help myself. No matter what sentence Jason eventually got, I knew I didn't want to be sentenced to a personal prison right along with him. I had to do more than just survive. The ripple effect of crime through families and communities is seldom, if ever, addressed, and the participation of people affected by the crimes is minimal or absent altogether. Restorative justice sees crime and violence not as an assault on the state, but as an assault on human relationships of trust. And so therefore, justice becomes an attempt not to punish, not to blame as the only method of moving ahead, but as an attempt to restore, to bring back, to create, repair, in some cases build for the very first time trust and safety within relationships. Through it all, though, so far, I somehow felt aware that I was living through something very extraordinary. I was seeing the worst of humanity right along with the best. Many people started to say, "You should write a book, Shannon." And though that was a completely overwhelming idea for me, somewhere deep down inside I did feel a pull to write. I knew that I needed to dump the hard drive of information and experience in my mind and make sense of it for myself. I wanted to transform telling my story into something that helped me, not something that hurt me more. I wanted to break down that stigma and tell the whole truth. I wanted to put everything I'd experienced into a human context to counter the cold and graphic way that newspapers printed the story. If I could do that, then I thought maybe I could help others. I was invited to speak at a restorative justice conference in Mexico to share my story. And with trepidation, I accepted the invitation and I revamped my victim impact statement and tried to add some of the ideas that I had about how truer justice might be brought about, the parts I knew never would have been allowed in a victim impact statement. And when I read my speech in Mexico when I told my story that time, the reception was wonderful. I felt validated and vindicated. And it was amazing to see a discussion light up about key topics in justice and healing. But for all I'd poured out in that first hour presentation, I'd only scratched the surface. I came nowhere close to telling my whole story, nor to addressing the questions that had come to the forefront for me as a person and as a citizen. What do we do when we're wronged? How do we respond? Will the response that we choose cause controversy or alienation? Or will we be lauded for acting in the right way? Who decides what is right? And what happens when the people or systems that we rely on let us down? What if justice turns out not to be something that is served, but something that we have to work for every day in our own lives? What if revenge and retribution don't heal? How can we move forward? What would be my next step forward? Finally, I made the decision to write because I don't want to live in a society where victims are expected to seek retribution or revenge or be kept locked into their victimhood forever by rage and resentment. I don't want family members of offenders to be deemed guilty by association, nor for offenders to be labeled monsters and locked away, most to be returned to society with no treatment. The life that I shared with Jason for me was like a tightly woven tapestry, ripped apart by violence and betrayal. In the early days, in those prison visits, some of the threads were worked back together by the restorative dialogue that we held, in which he was accountable and remorseful, and I had an opportunity to ask all of my questions and make him understand the full impact of what he'd done. One of my personal choices was to forgive Jason, never to condone what he did, but to commit to seeing the human being behind the horror, because there was one. And sometimes people criticize forgiveness. They say that it's weak or that it lets someone off the hook. But what I know is that entering the forgiveness process and living it day after day has been one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. But it's had many rewards. It let me off the hook. It released me from a lifetime bond to the violence and betrayal that I hate so much. It turned out to be the best gift that I ever could have given myself. Because in forgiving, I regained my ability to love, to trust, to live fully, and pursue new dreams.